and it's chapter 10. Whether the chill of the ghost touch still ran in his veins, or whether his injuries, together with his long interrogations at Scotland Yard, had simply exhausted him, Lockwood was in a ropey state all day. Is this chinchilla for real? I have just started, and look at him. He really hates the camera when it's in that position, and it's in actually quite a precarious position at the moment. Sorry, give me 2 seconds whilst I get this sorted. I'll be right back. Sorry. I tried to bribe him back into his bed and it didn't work. So we've got him in a new position. He slept, this is Lockwood, as I did, for as much of the morning. At lunch he ate little, scarcely picking at George's fresh-made cottage pie and peas. He moved slowly, hardly spoke, which for Lockwood was unusual. After lunch he went into the living room and sat with his wounded arms swathed in hot water bottles, staring dully out the window. George and I stayed near him in companionable silence throughout the afternoon. I read a cheap detective novel. George conducted experiments on the trapped ghost in the jar, using small electrical currents to apply shocks to the glass. Whether out of protest or for some other reason, the ghost did not respond. Towards 4 o'clock, when the light was already failing, Lockwood startled us both by suddenly asking for our casebook. It was the first time he'd said anything in hours. "What have we got coming up, George?" he said when the black ledger had been fetched. "What have we got outstanding?" George turned the pages for the latest entries. "Not a great deal," he said. "Got a report of, quote, a terrifying black shape, unquote, seen in an off-licence car park early evening. Could be anything from a dark spectre to a grey haze. We were going to visit it tonight, but I've rung them to postpone. We've also got a, quote, sinister rapping sound, unquote, heard in a garden in Neasden. Possibly a stone knocker, even a weak poltergeist, but again, it's not enough info to be sure. Then there's a dark, still shadow seen at the bottom of Flinchley Gardens. Possibly a lurker or a shade. Oh, and an urgent request from Miss Eileen Smithers of Chortley. Every night, alone in the small hours, she hears. Hold it, Lockwood said. Eileen Smithers? Didn't we work for her before? We did. That time it was a, quote, ghastly disembodied howling, unquote, resounding about our lounge and kitchen. We thought it might be a screaming spirit, but in fact it was her neighbour's cat, Bumbles, trapped inside a cavity wall. Lockwood made a face. Oh Lord, I remember. And this time, an eerie, childlike wailing heard from her attic starts around midnight when "It'll be that bloody cat again." Lockwood removed his left hand from beneath the water bottles and flexed his fingers carefully. The skin was slightly blue. All in all, it's not the most thrilling program in the history of psychical detective investigations, is it? Lurkers, shades, and Bumbles the Ginger Tom. What happened to the good cases, like the Mortlake Horror or the Dulwich Wraith? If by good you mean a powerful, challenging ghost, I said, like last night's was pretty fine. Trouble was, we weren't expecting it. As the police in Scotland Yard repeatedly pointed out to me, Lockwood growled, "No, by good, I mean cases that might make us some money. None of this stuff's exactly big time." He subsided back into his chair. It was rare for Lockwood to mention money. It wasn't his usual motivation. There was an uncomfortable silence. "Funny enough, George has found out a bit about our ghost girl," I said brightly. "Tell him about it, George." George had been dying to get it off his chest all day. He whipped the article out of his pocket and read it through. Lockwood, who seldom had much interest in the identity of visitors, even when they hadn't injured him, listened indifferently. "Annabel Ward," he said at last. "So that was her name. I wonder how she died." "And who it was that killed her?" I added. Lockwood shrugged. 50 years is a long time. We'll never know. I'm more concerned about now. Her ghost has created a real mess for us. The police aren't at all happy about the fire. "So what did happen with them last night?" George said. "Not much. They took my statement. I argued our case pretty well. Dangerous visitor, our lives were at risk, had to act on the spur of the moment, all the obvious stuff. But they didn't seem convinced." He broke off, staring out the window again. "And now?" I said. He shook his head. "We'll have to see what happens." As to that, we found out sooner than expected. Not 20 minutes later, a brusque hammering sounded on the front door. George went to answer it. He returned with a blue-fringed visiting card and an expression of grim dismay. "Mr. Montague Barnes of Deeprack," he said bleakly. "Are you at home?" Lockwood groaned. "I'll have to be. He knows I'm in no state to go out today. All right, show him in." The Department of Psychical Research and Control for Deeprack, was one of the most powerful organisations in the country. It's sort of part of the government and sort of part of the police, but it's actually run by lots of old operatives who have grown too slow and decrepit to even be supervisors anymore. One of their main jobs is to keep tabs on the agencies and make sure that we all follow the rules. Inspector Barnes liked rules more than most. He was famously officious and had a deep dislike of anything that didn't follow Deeprack guidelines to the letter. Lockwood and George had crossed paths with him on several occasions, mostly before I'd joined the company. This was the first time I'd seen him at close quarters, so I studied him with interest as he entered the living room. He was a small man, wearing a dark, rather crumpled suit. His shoes were brown and scuffed. His trousers were just too long for him. He was dressed in a long brown raincoat that extended to his knees and had a brown suede bowler on his head. His hair was lank and thin, except under his nose, where sat a resplendent moustache, as coarse and tufty as a brand new scrubbing brush. His age was uncertain. Perhaps it was a lived-in 50. To me he seemed inexpressibly old, one short step from becoming a visitor himself. He had a melancholy, drawn expression, as if all light and joy had been surgically removed from his person under anaesthetic, leaving his loose skin and saggy beneath his eyes. These eyes, however, were shrewd and keen. Lockwood rose stiffly, gave him a cordial enough greeting, and ushered him to take a seat. George removed the ghost jar to the sideboard and concealed it under the spotted veil. I went to make some tea. When I got back, Barnes was sitting in the middle of the sofa, still wearing his coat and his hat. His hands were flat on wide-spaced knees. It was a posture that managed to be both domineering and awkward at the same time. He was staring at the collection of artifacts on the wall. Most people, he was saying in a somewhat nasal voice, make do with landscapes or rows of ducks. This stuff can't be hygienic. What's that moth-eaten thing? A Tibetan spirit pole, Lockwood said, at least 100 years old. My guess is that the lamas somehow directed roaming ghosts into those hollow metal globes hanging between the flags. Clever of you to pick it out, Mr. Barnes. It's one of the best pieces in my collection. The inspector snorted into his moustache. Looks more like foreign mumbo-jumbo if you ask me. He pulled his gaze round to meet ours. Well, he said, I'm pleased to see you both in good shape. Surprised, too, when I saw you in the garden last night. I thought you'd be in hospital for a week. There was just enough ambiguity in his tone to make me wonder if perhaps he'd hoped for this outcome as well. Lockwood made a regretful gesture. I'm sorry I wasn't able to stay and help out, he said. I wanted to, but the doctors were insistent. Oh, you couldn't have done anything, Barnes said. You'd have just got in the way. It was a heroic effort by the firefighters and agents who fought the blaze. They managed to save the bulk of the house, but the upper floor is a complete write-off thanks to you. Lockwood nodded stiffly. I've made my statement to your colleagues at the yard. I know. And I've spoken with Mrs. Hope, whose house you destroyed. Ah, and how's she doing? She's distraught, Mr. Lockwood, as you might imagine. I couldn't get much sense out of her, but she and her daughter are also very angry, and they're demanding compensation. Is that my tea? Lovely. He took a cup. Lockwood's face, already pale, grew paler. I quite understand that they're upset, he said, but speaking of professionals, accidents like this happen all the time in our work. Lucy and I had dealt with dangerous type 2s, which had killed before and was threatening our lives. Yes, the collateral damage was unfortunate, but I trust DPRAC will support us in meeting any costs. That DPRAC won't help you with a penny of it, Barnes said, sipping his tea. That's why I'm here. I've already checked with my supervisors, and they take the view that you disregarded several basic safety procedures in your investigations at Sheen Road. Most crucially, you chose to engage with the visitor without your iron chains. The fire was a direct result of that decision. The inspector wiped his moustache dry with the side of a finger. As far as compensation goes, you're on your own. But this is ridiculous, Lockwood said. Surely we can... There's no we in it. Barnes seemed suddenly irate. He got to his feet, brandishing the cup. If you and Miss Carlyle had done the sensible thing, if you'd left the house when you'd encountered the visitor, if you'd returned with better equipment, or, he glared round at us, with better agents, that house would still be standing. It's your fault, and I'm afraid I can't help you. Which brings me to the real point. He took a packet from his coat pocket. I have an envelope here from the Hope family solicitors. They're demanding immediate settlement for the damage caused by the fire. The sum is £60,000. You've 4 weeks to pay up, or they'll launch court proceedings directly against you. He pursed his lips. I hope you're as well off as you seem to be, Mr. Lockwood, because I can assure you that if you fail to meet this obligation, DPRAC will have to wind your agency up and shut Lockwood & Co. down. Nobody moved. Lockwood and I sat as if we'd been ghost-locked. Slowly, George took off his glasses and wiped them on his jumper. Now that he'd given us the fatal news, Inspector Barnes seemed restless and ill at ease. He stalked around the room, glaring at the artifacts, sipping his tea. Put the letter on the sideboard, please, Lockwood said. I'll look at it later. No good being miffed, Mr. Lockwood, Barnes said. This is what happens when an agency isn't properly run. No supervisors. Agencies with adults ensure everything's done with maximum care for propriety and minimum loss of life. But you, he waved his hand disgustedly, you're nothing but three kids playing at grown-up games. Everything in this house is a testament to that, even this rubbish on the wall. He peered at the small label. An Indonesian ghost catcher? Fiddle-faddle. Belongs in a museum. That collection was my mother's, Lockwood said quietly. The inspector didn't hear. He tossed the envelope onto the sideboard and, at the same moment, noticed the object concealed beneath the spotted handkerchief. Frowning, he flicked the cloth aside, revealing the yellow jar of smog. His frown deepened. He bent close, peering into its depths. And this? What's this monstrosity? Some other appalling specimen that should have been incinerated long ago. He tapped dismissively on the grass. I wouldn't do that, Lockwood said. Why not? A rush of yellow plasm. The ghost's face congealed into existence, directly opposite of Barnes' own, its eyes bulging out of its stalks, its mouth gurning wide, revealing an alpine range of jagged teeth. It was doing impossible things with its tongue. It was hard to guess exactly how much of the apparition the inspector saw. Certainly he sensed something. Emitting a whoop like a howler monkey, he sprang back in terror. His hand jerked high. Hot, strong tea rained down over his face and shirt front. The cup clattered to the floor. George, Lockwood said mildly, I told you to keep that jar downstairs. I know, I'm so forgetful. Barnes was blinking, gasping, wiping his face. You irresponsible idiots. That hellish thing. What is it? Not sure, George said. Possibly a spectre of some kind. Sorry about that, Mr. Barnes, but really, you shouldn't have looked so close. It's easily startled by grotesque shapes. The inspector had snatched up a napkin from the tea tray and was dabbing his shirt. Now he scowled around at us all. This is exactly what I'm talking about, he said. Jars like that shouldn't be kept in private homes. They need to be in secure locations, under control of responsible institutions, or better still, destroyed. What if that ghost got free? What if some kid came in and found it? I could barely see the outline, and it frightened me half to death. And if you go leaving it casually on a sideboard, he looked, Harry shook his head sourly. Like I say, you're just playing games. Well, I've said what I came here for. Read those documents, Mr. Lockwood, and think about what you want to do. Remember, 4 weeks is all you've got. 4 weeks and £60,000. No, don't bother seeing me out. I can manage, assuming some ghoul doesn't devour me in the hall. He slapped his hat on his head and stomped from the room. We waited until we heard the sound of the front door slam. Rather a tiresome meeting in so many ways, Lockwood said. But it perked up a little towards the end. Did it? George chuckled. That was priceless. Did you see the look on his face? I grinned. I've never seen anyone move so fast. He was absolutely petrified, wasn't he? Yeah, that was great. Really funny. Yes. Our laughter drained away. There was a long silence. We all stared out at nothing. Can you pay the hopes off? I said. Lockwood took a deep breath. The effort seemed to pain him. He rubbed the side of his ribs irritably. In a word, no. I've got this house, but not much in the bank. Nothing like enough to fix up the Hope's place anyway. The only way I could do it is to sell up here, and that's effectively the end of the agency, as Barnes well knows. For an instant, he seemed to shrink back in his chair. Then a switch was flicked and energy returned. He flashed us both a bruised, resplendent smile. But it's not going to come to that, is it? We've got 4 weeks. That's plenty of time to earn some real cash. What we need is a really high-profile case that gives us a bit of a significant publicity and gets the ball rolling. He pointed at the casebook on the table. No more of these rubbish shades and lurkers. We want something that'll truly make our name. Well, we'll get on to it tomorrow. No thanks, George. I don't want any tea. I'm a little tired, and if it's all the same to you, I'm off to bed. He said good night and left. George and I sat there, saying nothing. I didn't tell him, but we've lost one of those cases already, George said at last. They rang up today and cancelled. Heard about the fire, you see. The cat lady? I'm afraid not. One of the interesting ones. 4 weeks isn't really long enough to get that money, is it? I said. No. He was cross-legged on the sofa, chin resting gloomily on his hands. It's so unfair, I said. We risked our lives. Yeah. We faced down a formidable ghost. We made London a safer place. Yeah. We should get praised for this. George stretched, preparing to rise. Nice thought, but it's not the way things work. You hungry? Not really. Just exhausted. I think I'm going to bed too. I watched him gather up the tea things and retrieve the inspector's fallen cup from under the settee. At least Annabel Ward's dealt with, I said. That's a little consolation. He grunted. Yeah, you did that bit right, at least. That's the end of chapter 10.